Hello and welcome to today's webinar from Center for Healthy Sex. I'm Douglas Evans, the Executive Director here, and we're very happy to present to you Lance Tango, and he will be presenting to you on restorative engagement in intimate relationships. I think you'll find this to be really an interesting presentation because I know Lance very well, and he has some really interesting things to say about clients' recovery in many ways of their whole selves. So before I get into that, I'll just mention briefly that here at Center for Healthy Sex in West Los Angeles, we offer individual, group, and intensive psychotherapy for men, women, and couples on a whole spectrum of sexual concerns, and we welcome your inquiries through our website at centerforhealthysex.com, or feel free to speak to one of our intake counselors for a free confidential consultation anytime, 7 days a week at 310-843-9902. One of the other things we're excited to mention to you is our new book, Mirror of Intimacy, written by our founder, Alexandra Katahakis, as well as Tom Bliss, who is also one of our staff members here. And Mirror of Intimacy is a compilation of 365 daily reflections on emotional intelligence and enlightened sexuality. And we have many fans of this reading it via email every day, which you can sign up for on our website, or check out the book on Amazon. I wanted to just tell you a little bit about Lance and share with you some of his interests and perspective that you'll be hearing more about today. Lance is a licensed marriage and family therapist in Pasadena, California. He has a private practice there. You can find him on the web on his site, lancetangotherapy.com. And just a couple of segments from his website I thought were interesting that you might find interesting as well, is Lance's goal as a therapist is to help his clients restore their capacity for healthy interpersonal relationships by restoring their life experiences into proper historical context of resiliency, and to also help clients restore their dignified selves by addressing moral injuries that underlie traumatic experiences. He also helps clients with self-regulatory capacities by helping them regulate their nervous systems better. So it's my great pleasure to present to you Lance Tango.
All right, perfect. Thanks so much, Douglas.
Okay.
And hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Let's just jump right in. Today we're going to do a talk, or I'm going to conduct a talk on restorative engagement in intimate relationships. And there's quite a bit of information on here, so at the beginning it's probably not going to feel very interactive, and I apologize for that. And if you see me looking to the side, I'm just seeing all the people that have signed on saying hello, so welcome. And what I'd like to do is to just go over some of the information and the ways in which I conceptualize these ideas, and then open it up for questions and answers at different stages in the webinar, and then more so at the end. So if you all can bear with me, I'd like to just jump right in. So restorative engagement. So restorative engagement, the idea around this, in terms of where I came up with this and the goals for therapy, has always been for me about really bringing people back to a state of health and soundness, and to just their innate vigor. And to do this, I believe we can do this by just engaging with people and having conversations that have the intention of bringing people back to a state of health. In today's talk, we're going to talk about how this can be applied to intimate relationships, and that can include friendships, personally close relationships, familial relationships, and sexual relationships. So today when we're talking about intimacy, I imply the whole broad spectrum of what intimacy can be. And what I wanted to start with when I was putting this talk together is this idea of what are relationships for, and why do we engage in them, and why do they play such a central role in our culture? And I thought the best way to do this would be to look at various perspectives of how people understand why relationships exist. And let's start by just looking at a religious perspective of why relationships exist. According to different religions, many would say that human beings were put on this earth to have relationship with an all-powerful creator, whether that be God, several gods, goddesses. And then the other thing that the spiritual texts seem to imply is that human beings should be in relationship to be fruitful and to multiply. And there's this other idea that human beings, part of the relationship that we're in is in relationship to the actual creation of this God or gods, right? And so that we serve as witnesses and participants in the creation. From an evolutionary perspective, relationships exist for species survival and for species safety, that when human beings act as a group, that the likelihood of survival is increased significantly. And then also this idea of propagation and promoting genetic diversity, that through two people of different sexes coming together and having a child, that what that does is it increases genetic diversity by taking some of the genetic information from the mother and some of the genetic information from the father. And then the other thing that I considered was this social philosophical perspective, which suggests that relationships exist both for promoting group survival, safety, social thriving, but also this idea of further advancing the ongoing evolution of human consciousness. And what I mean by that is that when we get together as people and we share ideas, that new ideas come out of existing ideas. And that happens within a singular generation, and then that becomes even multifolded in a way from one generation to the next. So this idea of human beings being in relationship and coming together to advance human consciousness. Now, from a neuropsychobiological perspective, some of the folks would say that relationships exist as a way of helping a developing brain to develop health in a healthy way through social interaction. That when a mother or father interacts with an infant, with a baby, with a child, that brings certain neurological structures in the brain online, and it helps that child to develop a healthy brain, central nervous system, all of those biological components. Also, some of the neuropsychobiological folks say that relationship is an opportunity for people to really fine-tune maladapted neural pathways in the central nervous system through these co-regulatory processes. And I believe that's a lot of what happens in therapy or in any relationship where one person may be struggling with something that's emotionally difficult and the other person is able to hold kind of a stable foundation or center so that the other person is better able to regulate whatever emotional experiences are coming up for themselves as they relive or discuss this difficult event. So one of the things, or some of the things that I'd like to talk about, I highlighted in orange here, and these are the things that I think our talk is really going to focus on today. And when I looked at each of these items that are highlighted in orange, I really felt that we were called to do something in our relationships. And so looking at this first item of being a witness and a participant in creation, when I look at that, what I think is that we're called to accept that people are born into and operate within historical contexts. And therefore, we need to be curious about how those contexts, those historical contexts, shape who we are. Bell Hooks, who is a social activist and feminist author, she says that since loving is about knowing, we have more meaningful love relationships when we know each other, and it takes time to know each other. And I think that really supports this idea that being in relationship, we are called to know each other's historical experiences and to know each other well. Then, if we consider this idea of propagation and promoting genetic diversity, what I feel that calls us to do is to anticipate and embrace forthcoming generations and to proactively consider the evolving diverse needs of those generations. And so Erik Erikson, who was a developmental psychologist, he one time said that the only thing that can save us as a species is seeing how we're not thinking about future generations in the way that we live. Or in other words, we have to carefully consider how we're living today, how that's going to affect future generations, right? Then the next point of this idea of further advancing the ongoing evolution of human consciousness, something that I'm particularly interested in, I believe that what we're called to do is then to identify and address those places in our lives where we're emotionally or psychologically stuck so that we can create a healthier legacy for the next generation, that we can create a healthier jumping off point for the next generation. And this comes from personal experiences. And I think of my relationship with my father and all the ways that I think he desired to be a loving man, and in many ways he was. But then there was also violent abuse in my family growing up. And I wonder how much of that legacy that I grew up in of violence was a result of those places where my father was psychologically stuck. So I believe part of what we are called to do in relationship is to discover these places in ourselves where we are stuck as a way of creating something healthier for the people we're in relationship with, including the next generation. And then the last 2 points that you see in orange, this idea of developing a healthy human brain and fine-tuning maladaptive neural pathways, I believe what we are called to do when I look at those considerations is to utilize our relationships as a source for healthy human development and mutual healing, both in ourselves and for those people that we love. And the poet Maya Angelou, she wrote about love, that love of a family, the love of one person can heal, and it heals the scars left by a larger society. So these points here, these 4 points, are my ideas of why relationships exist and what they call us to do. And I think each of you probably have your own ideas, and I would encourage you strongly to keep thinking about what relationships mean to you and how you see yourself using relationships in your life. And so the next thing that I think grows out of those ideas is that, well, then how do we do this? And so I have a long list of things here, and I'm going to go over them a little bit at a time so we don't have to take this in all at once. And I'd like to start with just the first couple of points. This idea of identifying our personal core values and developing a holistic philosophical understanding of why relationships exist. So in terms of our core values, that is this idea of what motivates you moment to moment on a daily basis. And these are values that can include things like generosity, compassion, kindness, courage, right, genuineness. All of these things, I think we should be able to identify these as our core values, and that we should all know them fairly well for ourselves as we move through the world. And then this idea of deepening philosophically is, especially as it relates to relationships, right, a philosophical understanding of why relationships exist, that's largely the conversation we've had in this webinar up until now. I gave you all of my reasons of why I think relationships exist, and I think it's important for all of us to develop those same thoughts and sources of motivation for ourselves. And so I'd like to categorize this as being philosophically centered. And the great, expert on mythology, Joseph Campbell, he said that in one way or another, we all have to find what best fosters the flowering of our humanity in this contemporary life and dedicate ourselves to that. And he also went on to say that when we quit thinking primarily about ourselves and our own self-preservation, we undergo a truly heroic transformation of consciousness. And when I read these ideas from Joseph, I think what he's implying is he's asking us to be philosophically centered in our lives. And so this idea of a self and self-preservation and heroic transformation, one of the things I think about is that when we conceptualize ourselves as these independent beings without any relationship to anything, it can be fairly isolating. It can seem sort of random, like we don't have anything to connect ourselves to. And I believe the way that we are oriented in this world, at least the way that I experience myself in this world, is through this experience of time, right? That moment by moment, year by year, I see myself in a different way. And so I believe there's an overlay of the self onto this idea of time. And so when we think of ourselves in context to time, then I think we have to acknowledge that much of who we are has been shaped by history, our personal history, the history that we found ourselves born into, right? The history that happened even before we were born. That all of those things serve to shape who I am today. And so I have a relationship with history. The other thing that I have a relationship with as it relates to time is my future. That whatever I do today, however I act today, is going to have some sort of impact tomorrow or on the next moment. And so I really see the self as being oriented in this framework of time, both as it relates to our historical experiences and the things that we hope for ourselves in the future. And this is part of what I think it means to be philosophically centered, as opposed to just thinking of our own selves as a disconnected, isolated being. And this idea of, if we take this idea back to time, whatever happens to us, right, we can choose to interact with those events in certain ways so that it creates a different outcome. And so really I believe the self is a bridge between what has happened before and then what happens after, what happens in this next moment. And by conceptualizing ourselves in this way, that's what I think Joseph Campbell talks about when he talks about heroic transformation. Because when we orient ourselves in relationship to an idea of a before and after, that's when we find opportunities to look at any trauma we've experienced, or if we love someone who's experienced trauma, right, that we can see that individual and how that individual might be shaped by those experiences, and through activities and intentions and relationships, we can then undergo a heroic transformation that transforms that trauma into healing. So this also, I'm particularly interested in issues of justice and social justice, and so I believe this is true also as it relates to injustice and justice. How are we going to show up in a way where we transform experiences or realities of injustice into something that looks more like justice, right? And this is what I mean when I say we have to be philosophically centered, and that includes identifying our core values and being deeper philosophically for understanding why relationships exist. Now, going back to the original list that we had, the next thing under this idea of philosophical centeredness is when we inquire and we listen to other people. And I'll come back and say more about that. But I found that when we do that in relationship with the person that we love, care about, people that we're close to, that sometimes that can trigger certain amounts of discomfort in ourselves. And how much are we aware of the ways in which we're triggered by what we're hearing, the ways we might feel competitive, threatened, confused by what we're hearing in this other person. And so this idea of developing keen interoception or self-awareness, I believe, is vital to establishing the kind of relationships that uphold these relational values that we talked about earlier. Oops. Let me backtrack here. So the other thing is this idea of tolerating moments of relational insecurity and tolerating moments of psychological discomfort. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes in our relationships, if you all are anything like me, a lot of the arguments that I find myself in with my intimate other has always grown out of these moments of disconnect, of insecurity or discomfort in the relationship, frustration, anger, disappointment, any of those things. And so this is what I'm talking about when I talk about tolerating discomfort and insecurity in relationships. And so I would categorize this as mindful self-regulation, that part of what is required of us in relationships is to learn how to mindfully self-regulate. Erich Fromm, who is a social philosopher, he was also a psychoanalyst and therapist, he said that the task we must set for ourselves is not to feel secure, but to be able to tolerate insecurity. And much of this talk actually grows, this talk that I'm giving today, grew out of this very quote. And what does it mean to tolerate insecurity? And so when I think of insecurity in relationships, oftentimes what I have thought of is how those insecurities, those discomforts have grown out of us having a desired outcome for our interactions with this other person that we're in relationship with. And when those outcomes don't happen, it causes something uncomfortable. And those desired outcomes, I believe, are things like certainty, right? That we need answers, and we need them right now. And we're looking for that approval or that acceptance in these very concrete, certain ways from our significant others. And the other thing that I think we look for in relationship as a desired outcome that can be a source of discomfort when it doesn't happen is this idea of perfection, this idea of right versus wrong, of good versus bad. And so oftentimes the arguments that I see in my therapy room when I'm working with couples, or arguments that I've been in myself with my significant other or people that I care about, is this idea of it's important for me to be right now, and that I'm actually going to make that a bigger priority than me trying to understand your point of view. And so out of that need to be right, or out of that need to be somehow perfectly good or to be certain of things, I lose sight of my significant other, and I become more connected with the agenda I have in that moment. So one of the things that I try to remember, and I remind couples that I work with, is that love actually requires not certainty nor perfection. And so I'll say more about this, that in fact, if certainty and perfection were easily attainable, I don't even think we would have a use for love. There would be no need to love. In other words, love's purpose is to fill in the gaps where uncertainty and imperfection exist. And the prime example of this is the love that I see between a parent and a child, right? That when children come into this world, and I don't have any children, so I can say this, I think every parent sees their child as being perfect, but that perfection grows out of really the love that parent has for that child. Because me, from the outsider, let's say we're in a public space and I see this child and they're screaming and they're crying and they're making a mess while they're trying to eat, I don't see that child necessarily as being perfectly developed, but I do see that child as being lovable. And so this is a really important point that I think we miss in this culture, and that is this idea that the people that we love, we need to stop trying to figure out how to make them more perfect, and we need to stop trying to figure out how to create more certainty in our relationships. That in fact, what that is an opportunity when we see imperfection in our significant other, or when we feel uncertain about our relationship, that's an opportunity to recruit this idea of love to fill in the gaps, right? So remember, this idea of dealing with insecurity or discomfort, it's not about extinguishing discomfort or insecurity. It's about learning how to tolerate discomfort and insecurity. And why I say that is because if we try to extinguish these things, if we always try to feel comfortable in our relationships, if we always want our relationships to look perfect, well then we're just promoting again this very thing that's the source of discomfort, which is certainty and perfection. Whereas if we learn how to tolerate discomfort and insecurity, we don't freak out when it shows up, and we don't feel guilty or ashamed or embarrassed when we're in this relationship with someone we love and we get into an argument where we say silly and hurtful things, that we're able to more quickly come back together and reconnect if we don't add this extra layer of beating ourselves up for not being perfect. So how do we prepare for these moments of relational insecurity? Well, I think part of it is through reflection and mindful practices, and that could be different things for different people. I think what comes to mind for a lot of people is meditation practices. But also I think this other idea of just even reflection, of going back to this idea of being philosophically centered and remembering, taking a moment every day or a few moments every day to remember, why do relationships exist and what is my point for being here on this planet and what do I want my life to be about? That when we keep practicing that's going to better prepare us for these moments of relational insecurity. And then I think we have to discover what is actually underlying the insecurities that we experience in these relationships, right? So that when I'm in relationship with someone and that individual does something or says something and I fly off my handle, what's causing that? That I need to think about those moments after the fact and actually in between those times when we do get into arguments. And what I've come to find for myself is that what underlies the insecurity are these messages that I'm not enough, or my efforts are meaningless, that I'm not deserving of love, that my love will never be good enough, that I'm dispensable, that I'm insignificant, right? And so these fears, these insecurities, they may look different for you, or they may look different to the people that you are in relationship with. But I think it's important for all of us to take time to identify what these things are when we're in a better headspace, as opposed to trying to figure them out when we're engaged with someone else and things are falling apart right in front of our faces. And then I think the other thing we have to do is to evaluate how these insecurities are fueled by shame and by fear. And what I mean by that is all of these things that I have listed in green, that I'm not enough, that I'm dispensable, I'm insignificant, that triggers in me fear. It is rooted in shame, and these messages come from different places, which we don't have to get into now. But I think it's important for us to understand how shame and fear tie into this. And the reason why, if you look at the next point, is because when we are in a healthier state, right, when we're having a good day, when we feel loved, when we've gotten good news, and we have a clearer, more objective way of seeing ourselves, I think that we can see that our fear and shame, that they have a porous nature, that they're not as solid as we think they are. And what I mean by a porous nature, almost like a sponge, right, that there's all these little holes in it. And we may experience in the moment when the fear and the shame, when they come up unexpectedly, as this really solid, very kind of inflexible thing. But in those times when we are in a healthier state of mind and we take a careful look at our fear and shame, I believe we will discover for most of us that it's porous in nature, that it has a loose structure to it. And if it doesn't, that's actually one of the indicators, I think, for my clients of when I suggest therapy. Because it becomes important then to work with someone until the fear and the shame we experience, that we can see how they are porous in nature. Okay? And then the next point is that these porous spaces that I talked about in fear and shame, that those are actually, I think we have to use those as the sites, the little locations for where we develop loving kindness toward ourselves, toward our own shame, toward our own fear, and perhaps imagining that other people struggle from these same sources of fear and shame. And so when we develop loving kindness to ourselves, we can also imagine holding loving kindness for other people, right? And so this is a painful process, and it's uncomfortable to do that. And as Carl Jung says, that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. And I believe in order for us to be healthier in our relationships, we have to be able to do uncomfortable and painful work sometimes. So what do we do when these moments actually do arise? When relational insecurity arises, when emotional discomfort arises, what do we do? We've done all this work to prepare for these moments, and what do we do when these moments actually show up? Well, what we need to do is we need to breathe. We need to take a moment and to breathe. In the same way that when we we breathe, it's a way of self-regulating the central nervous system. And so if we're not breathing, we're going to move into an experience of panic, right? So breathe. The other thing that I think we need to do, and we will get better at this over time, is just to notice when fear and shame arises in us. In this moment when I'm interacting with my significant other and things are getting a little bit unstable, can I take a breath and can I notice if any fear or shame arises? And then if it does, hopefully I've done enough work, preparatory work, to remember that, oh yeah, the fear and the shame that's coming up, it's porous in nature, that it's not as solid as maybe it feels right now. And I know that because I've thought about this in other moments when I felt better about myself. And then in that moment, when we're interacting with someone and this discomfort or insecurity comes up and we're able to somehow remember that the fear and shame that we're feeling, there's a porousness to it, that's when we begin to infuse our core values, our relational philosophical intentions, this idea of loving kindness into the gaps, into the spaces of that porous experience of fear and shame. And all of these things, I think, they take practice, and we can't expect to do them perfectly. I think when we try them, we have to remember that we just need to do the best we can. We don't need to turn this into yet another opportunity to shame ourselves. And so when we show up in relationship in this way, I believe it's important to not strive for perfection or certainty. Don't expect that you're going to be able to get through these difficult conversations perfectly. It's going to be messy, right? But when we can accept that, it then allows us another opportunity to fill in the gaps of all the messiness, all the ways that this conversation happened in this really imperfect, ugly way, all the gaps that appear from that. That then becomes another opportunity for us to fill the gaps with love, with our intentions, and with our core values. So all of this is really what I think is important to being able to mindfully self-regulate. Also, I was thinking of a quote from Carl Jung where he says that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. And this is the work, right? This is what it means to be in relationship with people. And this isn't easy work. It's hard work, but as Martin Luther King Jr. says, that change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but it comes through continuous struggle. And so this is where our work is, right? So the next point that I want to look at is this idea of embodying our core values during moments of insecurity and discomfort, and remembering the philosophical reasons why relationships exist, and to engage in a manner that embodies those philosophical reasons, all of which come from the point at the top of being philosophically centered, right? That when we are able to embody those philosophies in our relationships, then I think we're able to step into our relationships with more enlightened intentionality. So enlightened intentionality, I just thought of some people who have inspired me and have looked for quotes about what their intentions are, right? And so Mother Teresa has said that if we have no peace, it is because we have forgotten that we belong to each other. So it seems to me that her intentionality in relationship is to remember that we belong to each other, which has allowed her to do the work that she did for as long as she did it. And Archbishop Desmond Tutu, he went to say that my humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be human together. Another example of enlightened intentionality that allows us to show up in relationship in a way that promotes ideas like justice and healing. And then Rebecca Walker, who is an author and also a feminist and a teacher, she said that I think all human beings really want to have deep connection with one another. And we want to feel deep love, deep safety, deep acceptance, and deep peace. And so this is actually the intentionality that I try and hold in my relationships, so that I can remember in those moments when I'm feeling disconnected from the people I care about, that maybe instead of trying to be right, maybe instead of trying to have the last word, maybe instead of trying to come out as the winner, that what I need to hold as an intention is this idea that what I really want is deep connection with the people in my life, right? So, so far we talked about philosophical centeredness, mindful self-regulation, enlightened intentionality, and the next part is this idea that I mentioned briefly earlier of inquiring and listening. And the reason that it's so far up on this list is I believe that when we inquire and engage with our significant others and really listen to what they say, that's when sometimes we get triggered by something that they've said or shared that makes us uncomfortable. And so that's when it becomes important to learn how to mindfully self-regulate and to be able to embody our intentions. Now, one of the things that I think is important to engaging in these restorative ways is learning how to validate the other person's experience until that person feels understood, and also to be able to express our own experiences. Another way of putting that is our willingness to be vulnerable, of our willingness to show up in relationships in a way that's honest. So these ideas are about inquiring and listening, about validating and expressing, that these are important components to showing up in healthy relationships. And also, I'd like to add these ideas of exchanging permission for feedback to be given and received free of shame. And what I mean by that is I try to, in my relationships, or when I'm working with clients, right, if I'm working with a couple, I ask each person in that relationship to give each other permission, to give each other feedback, to give each other permission also to give feedback and to listen to the feedback without having to feel ashamed about it. That when we give permission to the people in our lives to give feedback to us, that creates an opportunity for us to figure out how to grow and develop more, right? And also to not just give permission to the people in our lives to do that for us, but also having the people that we're in a relationship with also give us that permission, right? For them to say to me, to say to Lance, I really want you to give me feedback in a way that doesn't feel shameful, right? So they've given me that permission. And then the last piece is exchanging permission for requests to be made. Because one of the things that, and it surprised me when it started showing up in my work with clients, is, especially couples, that one of the biggest triggers that shows up in relationships is when we request something of somebody else. And that making a request, for some of us, asking for help, we feel terribly uncomfortable asking for help. For others, when someone asks us to do something for them, we feel burdened by it. We feel resentful, right? So giving permission to each other in relationships to make requests in a way where we don't have to feel guilty about it or to feel bad about it, I think that this is important. And when we're able to do these things, to inquire and to listen, to validate, to express, to exchange permission, and to make requests, that's when I think we're able to engage with consciousness. So this idea of conscious engagement is really the final piece to showing up in relationships in a healthy way. And what Bell Hooks says is that love is really more of an interactive process. It's about what we do. It's about what we do, not just what we feel. It's a verb, not a noun. And I really like this quote from Bell Hooks because it's about engagement. It's about not being concerned of our feelings for love as much as it's suggesting that love is a way of showing up, that it's an active process. Jane Goodall, who is considered the foremost expert on chimpanzees and was also an anthropologist, she said that what makes us human, I think, is an ability to ask questions, a consequence for sophisticated spoken language. And so if Jane believes that what makes us human is our ability to ask questions, then I think it's important to use that very quality, that unique qualities that human beings have in our relationships. And so that's why I think it's important for us to learn how to inquire and to listen to each other and to make requests and to give feedback. And then Albert Einstein said that peace cannot be kept by force, that it can only be achieved by understanding. And this goes back to this idea that if we're looking to have an experience of peace in our relationships sometimes, that what is important is this characteristic, this quality of understanding. And Mahatma Gandhi said that we win justice quickest by rendering justice to the other party. And so to me, this suggests that what we're looking for in our relationships, it needs to be reciprocal, and that we need to know how to show up in our relationships just as much willing to grant these qualities as much as we are willing to show up waiting for these qualities to be granted to us. So all of these ideas that we just went over, specifically being philosophically centered, having the ability to mindfully self-regulate, to show up with enlightened intentionality, and to engage in a conscious way, to me, these are the components of what I call restorative engagement. And restorative engagement, what I believe the benefits of this is that it fosters a relational environment of safety, that it creates opportunities for vulnerability and openness for both ourselves to show up as more vulnerable and open, and also for the people in our lives, for them to show up in ways that are more vulnerable and more open. I also believe that it increases the likelihood that vulnerability will be met with loving kindness and empathy, and that it will cultivate feelings of being witnessed, understood, known, and connected, which I really believe is what we're all looking for in our relationships. And that it promotes healing of past wounds, including abuses, disappointments, losses, betrayals that we've experienced. And that allows for reciprocity and cooperation. And finally, that it restores dignity and mutual empowerment. So these are all of my ideas about restorative engagement, both why I what inspired me to develop this way of conceptualizing relationships, and then all the processes that are involved in it. So all of that being said, I appreciate you all kind of listening to what I had to say, and now I'd like to open this up for questions that you might have or thoughts, and if you just type them up, they're going to show up on my screen, and then I can respond to them. So is there anything any thoughts, questions anybody had? What we can do, I'm not getting any questions right now, is I can put up some of the components that I thought people would have questions about. And so we can start with this. Oh, someone has a question. Okay. So someone's wondering if I have like an example of a case study of a situation that was resolved through restorative engagement. And that's a tricky thing. What I'm thinking about is the work that I do with couples. And I don't know that my couples knew at that moment that what I was asking them to do was to show up in a way that embodies restorative engagement. But many times what I found, actually, let's go down to here, because I think this becomes, this is a critical point. Many times when couples show up in my office, they believe that the reason that there's something wrong with their relationship, the reason that they're in couples therapy, is because there's a lot of fighting, there's a lot of arguing, and therefore, I really want my significant other to change in this way or that way, and so I want this person to understand that they need to change. And so in those moments, what I do is I try to facilitate a conversation of what each person in that relationship, what they're hoping the other person to be more like, right? In what ways do you want your significant other to change? And the fact and then I ask them the question, the fact that your significant other isn't this way yet, does that indicate to you that there's something wrong in the relationship? And many times I get this answer back that, yeah, that's the whole reason that we're here, is because they're this way. And so I really start opening up a conversation that embodies these ideas that are on the screen, that love actually doesn't require your significant other to be perfect, right? Or you to have a certain amount of guarantees in your relationship. And that, in fact, if your significant other was perfect, right, or if your relationship did have certain guarantees to it, then what would the role of love be in your relationship, right? Would your relationship even need love if your significant other was perfect? And when I ask this question, it usually stumps the couples that I'm working with. They just don't know how to answer that. And so I suggest to them in those moments that actually, what if the very idea of loving someone suggests that, oh, I'm going to be with this person despite the fact that they're imperfect, right? And so this becomes a shift in a person's thinking of what both relationships are for and what is this experience of love for. That it really, what does it mean for me now that I'm starting to question that maybe my significant other doesn't need to be perfect, but instead what I need to learn how to do more is to be loving. And this is, all of these things are very counter. They're pretty much opposite to what we hear in the media all the time, and commercials and advertisement, all of these things, because everything that we are told to consider spending our money on or our time on is always about how do I become more perfect, or how do I convince my other person, this person I'm in a relationship with, to become more and more perfect. And I'm suggesting, no, we don't need to learn how to be more perfect. We need to learn how to be more loving. So that's kind of a general description of how I use this in the therapy that I do. So one of the questions that showed up on the side is Jill sent a question asking, how can I be with my husband in the ways that I'm speaking, right? When my husband has a difficult time being honest and loyal. Well, that's a good question. I think we all need to ask ourselves, because when there's infidelity in the relationship, when there's a lot of lying in the relationship, at some point we have to ask ourselves, what is the reason that I'm in this relationship? What do I believe relationships are for? And if one of the answers that you come up with for yourself is that I believe relationships are I want to show up in relationships, or I believe relationships exist so that I can help this person I'm in a relationship with, to help them heal from something they went through, right? Well, then that can be a motivator for us to stay in that relationship, right? But if our list of reasons for why relationships exist, if there's nothing in that list that we come up with for ourselves that suggests that, I believe relationships exist to help other people heal, then I'm not sure, and I say this to my clients, I'm not sure that all the work it's going to take for you to possibly get a different outcome with your husband or your significant other, I don't know what's going to get you through all of that difficult work that lies ahead of you, right? But if your intention is, no, I am in a relationship to both heal myself and to heal my significant other, and to really grow and foster these ideas of what it means to be healthy human beings, that can get us through the difficult times. And so really the answer is about being patient. It's about, I think, embodying these things in ourselves. And so, Jill, you asked the question, how do you do this? Well, we can't always change other people. And sometimes the best we can do is is continue to grow ourselves, to continue developing and embodying the things we believe in. And that if that in and of itself inspires our significant other to also change, if it inspires or gives opportunities for our other person that we're in relationship with to become more self-reflective, then I think that's where we begin. But if all the work that we do for ourselves to show up more consciously, to better embody the things we believe in, to express openly the ideas why we believe relationships exist, if all of that doesn't create a shift in our significant other, then I think that's when couples counseling comes into play, honestly. Because I think what couples counseling can do is it can create a space for both people to get their ideas out there of what they want in this relationship. And we can foster an honest conversation about what are your intentions for this relationship and what are your intentions for this relationship. And then if both people come up with a list of intentions that don't match, then I think it becomes important to have a conversation of, okay, so here are different intentions in this relationship. Can those overlap? Are those negotiable, and are they not? And if not, what does that mean? If they are negotiable, well, then how are we going to negotiate that? And then we can move this forward. But that's really when I think it's important to bring a third party in. Let's see. So, Jill, I hope that answers your question. And there's some others that have come up while I've been yammering on the side. Bear with me a second. I'm not the quickest reader. So someone asked the question, do you think, though, that sometimes we're trying to be too nice to each other? Is there a role for nonviolent tension, especially regarding sexual intimacy? Are you trying to be too nice to each other? Sometimes, well, one of the things I think of is a quote from Gandhi, and I'm not going to get this right. I'm paraphrasing it. But this idea that there are folks who are nonviolent because they're afraid of violence, as opposed to people who are nonviolent because they believe that's really the better way to be, right? So what are the reasons for us being nice? Is it because we're afraid to say difficult things? Is it because we're afraid to have difficult conversations? Because that can be problematic, right? And that to me seems disingenuous. And so when we show up in a way where we're just always trying to be nice to each other and always try to please each other, that can be problematic because I don't think it promotes growth. I mean, this slide that's up here, one of the things that it suggests, or maybe not this exact slide, is that out of pain comes growth, right? There was a quote earlier that I put up here from Jung that said that the path toward consciousness requires pain and discomfort. And so I think we need to be unafraid to have difficult conversations. But that doesn't mean that having a difficult conversation should just give us permission to be mean. I think there's ways of saying that I disagree with your ways of thinking, or the way that you did that thing, the way you acted, the way you carried that out, that was particularly hurtful for me, and I found that offensive. But I think having that conversation doesn't imply that we're being mean, right? And then this idea of sexual intimacy, and I don't know the context in which the question was being asked, but I don't particularly believe that sex always has to be, I don't know, easygoing, nice, conventional. That for many people, sex can look a whole lot of different ways. That it can embody characteristics of aggression, right? Or some sort of visceral energy behind it. But I think what's important is that it's consensual, right? And if two people agree that they want something in their sexual relationship that isn't just about vanilla sex, that's fine, but I think it should be consensual. Let's see. Someone asked a question. how can a person take steps toward becoming more comfortable with security? If one has been avoiding relationships and sex for years, do I have any concrete suggestions for how to move toward relationships and out of security of isolation? And the person that's asking that is Jesseline. And I don't know if so here's the funny thing. I think in order for us to step out of isolation, right? If isolation is where we feel most secure, and you're asking the question, how do we move out of that? That's a tricky thing because there is no shallow end to slowly dip our toe into. It's almost like we just have to jump right into the deep end, and that can feel overwhelming. Because there isn't a way to only be partially isolating. In a way, when we move out of isolation, we become very exposed. And so, if Jesseline, if you're asking that from a place of having people in your life that you do trust, or if this is even maybe for a client you're working with, if the situation is about someone who has nobody, and how do we help them to engage in the world? Well, I think therapy can be helpful. I think belonging to some sort of spiritual community can be helpful. Having a mentor can be helpful. I think it has to start with someone who plays a role of a trusted individual who has certain ethical and moral obligations to show up in a way that is safe for other people. That can become the testing ground to experiment with how do I learn to re-engage with people. And I'm going to choose this person who's a professional therapist because I know that morally and ethically they're required to show up in a way that is about my best interest as opposed to their best interest, right? If this individual has people in their lives, trusted friends, family members, then I think it's important to start with them. And that this is all about experimentation. And if we have trusted individuals in our lives, right, and we can share with these individuals that I'm just trying to figure out how to move out of this isolation, making that explicit and telling this other person, I want you to be a part of that process for me. And I don't know what that's going to look like yet. But here's the reasons that I do feel like I am isolating, right, and give the list of reasons. And so I'm wondering if you and I can talk about these things so that we can really explore what they mean to me, explore whether or not these are ideas that I can change, that are flexible, how much of these things are really kind of implanted into the core of who I am. And to really explore these things in an open and honest way with a trusted person, I think is a great starting off point. Because we get to then, that person then gets to have a better understanding of oneself. And also through that dialogue with this other person, they get to experiment with what it means to be vulnerable and see if it feels safe or if it feels overwhelming. Maybe I reveal too much of myself, so I'm going to pull back a little bit, right? So I think it's a process. If we can find a trusted individual, if we're all on our own on this, it's a very different story, and I think that would involve finding someone who does this, I guess, professionally. Okay. Let's see. Oh, okay. So Jenny asked this question of, have I found an efficient and productive way to work with someone who sees relationships as competitive and conflicts with this win-lose situation? Yeah, what I start with is I would start with this idea of what do you think relationships, why do they exist? And if this person says, well, relationships exist to be competitive, and relationships exist so that I can have a platform to always be right, then that's important information. I doubt that the person's going to say that, though, right? So if you can ask this person, or this couple, what do you really believe relationships are for, and what do you want your relationship to embody? Do you want your relationship to be about competitiveness, right? The chances are they're saying, well, no, I don't want relationships to be about competitiveness, right? Then you can ask them, well, what do you want it to be about? And you might find that couple is going to say, well, I just want this relationship. I want to feel supported in this relationship is what I want, right? I want to feel backed up. I want to feel like I'm understood. And then so we can start to see, oh, okay, what is showing up as competitiveness, really what I think is underlying that is that the dynamics in this relationship have been set up in a way where understanding it's an either you win or I win situation, as opposed to this idea that, oh, is there a way for us to both understand each other, have different ideas, maybe not agree, but at least understand each other and still be respectful, right? Some people, I'm thinking of my father when you asked this question. For my father, his idea of being understood was that we just had to agree with him. And so he operated in our family in a way where he always had to be right. And so that was the source of his frustration, and the ways in which he was kind of demeaning all the time was because it was so important for him to be right. And really, later in life, as I reflected more on it, I said, oh, no. I don't think my father was really always wanting to be right. I think he wanted to be understood. Because even when we finally relented and gave in to my father and said, okay, fine, we'll do it your way, you're right, he wasn't happy, right? He was still fuming, and he couldn't understand why, and he was so agitated. And I thought, I wonder if I would have had the foresight back then to, instead of just relenting and say, or just giving in and saying, okay, you're right. If instead I would have had the insight to say to my father, I finally understand why this is important to you. And I understand why you want me to see things your way. Like, I understand this. I think that would have been a more important conversation. And so, Jenny, to answer your question about competitiveness and conflicts in relationship, I would ask you to look very closely at this competitiveness, and is competitiveness actually a strategy for understanding that is backfiring, that isn't providing the results that person is looking for, right? So I hope that's helpful. And I think we're just over 1 o'clock right now, so that's about all the time that we have. I appreciate everybody chiming in and listening to this. I hope that the information was helpful to you in some ways. And if you have questions, feel free to reach me either by phone or send me an email. I'd love to answer that. Or if there's even things you want to take me to task on and things you disagree with and you think I missed the points of certain things, feel free to send me an email. I would love to open up a dialogue. And because, like I said, this is all about being open to feedback, and I give you permission to give me feedback. And then to the people that are sending comments of thank you on the side, Paul and Carolyn and Jim and Jenny and all of the other folks on there that I'm not able to see right now, thank you for participating. I'm so glad that you were here to join us in this. And I wish you the best for this weekend. And, again, feel free to reach out if you have any other questions. Okay. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Lance Tango, thank you so much, Lance. It's always enlightening to hear you. This is Tom Bliss. I'm our project manager. You can find this lecture on our YouTube channel. Please join us next month for Kelly McDaniel, the author of Ready to Heal, about helping women break free from addictive relationships. And she'll be discussing her philosophy with that book. Thanks so much for joining us. See you next time.